So when you initially launch the APM application, the landing page is going to be a dashboard similar to the one shown here. I'm not going to spend too much time here because any of the information that resides within APM can be rendered onto a dashboard and customized in any way. Just know that this is highly flexible and highly configurable. Where I am going to start is actually walking through in a live fashion that 4-step work process that underpins the APM application of assess, protect, monitor, and act. So where, of course, we're going to start is step 1, which is assess risk. So I'm going to select a risk assessment here, and essentially where APM begins and what APM offers you is a mechanism to assess and monetize risk within your operation. This assessment shown is all about understanding where to focus and the size of the prize. Also, what I'm showing here is a freemium offering for anyone to use just by going to assetriskanalyzer.com, and we will provide a link for that as well. There is also a predefined query in Hexagon EAM that we can share that pulls information needed for this risk assessment in the right format, right from EAM, and just allows you to run the assessment very easily. So using this risk assessment, we are looking at existing operational risk relative to industry standards, and then monetizing the consequence of that risk exposure. The analyzer evaluates historical performance of the assets, calculates a mean time between failure, which is based on EAM data about when corrective and reactive work was done, and compares that to industry benchmarks so that you know where to focus first and ultimately get the biggest bang for your buck. You can quickly identify the number of assets which are underperforming or performing below industry standards. So in this case, we're assessing 26 assets, and 6 of them have a lower than expected characteristic life. We also roll up the worst case consequence of failure in terms of both labor and material costs, which are usually found on the work order. But we also like to put in production losses, any downtime, opportunity cost, safety, quality, delivery, those types of losses, just so you can get a full picture of what the consequence would be, the monetized consequence, should this asset fail. And then this overall picture, as you multiply probability of failure times cost of failure, gives you your total risk, monetized risk assessment, and just directionally shows you, where do I start? Which assets would benefit the most from an asset strategy? And so this gives you, again, that directional information so that you can actually achieve the most value right out of the gate. So once you've done your risk assessment and you've identified which assets are demonstrating the highest level of risk exposure for you, step 2 in the process is protect. How do we put in place strategies that actively mitigate risk and protect your assets from unforeseen failures? So we do that by applying an asset strategy or an asset twin to those pieces of equipment. So let's take a look at what I mean by an asset strategy. So what is being shown here is a virtual representation of a full strategy for a piece of equipment. Again, this can be pulled from our strategy library, or we can ingest an existing RCM or FMEA, but ultimately the strategy should define the failure modes, all the ways an asset can fail, and then apply what we call protections to mitigate the risk of that failure from occurring. So in this diagram, in the center is the asset. Around that asset in the light blue circles are all the failure modes. And then for each failure mode, there are a series of protections in green that you can do, again, to mitigate the risk of that failure mode from occurring. There are 3 different types of protections we typically look at: activity-based protections, condition-based protections, and pattern-based protections, where we leverage AI and machine learning analytics to detect patterns and ultimately emergent failures. Activity-based protections are any actions you take to maintain or collect information about the asset at a certain frequency. For example, performing thermography every 6 weeks or doing daily operator rounds checks. These are all activity-based protections. And usually this information is extracted from your list of PMs defined in EAM or from an electronic round solution where, again, you're collecting information every day about the asset condition. The second type of protection we find in an asset strategy is a condition-based protection, such as looking at an inboard bearing temperature and then evaluating that temperature data against different thresholds that are set. Usually this data is continuous and it comes from a historian or a SCADA system at the plant. And the third type of protection, and I'll say the most sophisticated type of protection, is pattern protection, which again uses artificial intelligence and machine learning analytics to evaluate and look for patterns in the data and then automatically alert you when those patterns or behaviors are detected. Now, although the AI ML analytics are more sophisticated in nature, the ability to build and tune those AI models and then simulate different scenarios based on different sets of data is actually extremely user-friendly and completely code-free. So absolutely no coding required, no data science degree required to utilize those AI ML algorithms. And, these are really important, obviously, for evaluating data really rapidly and ultimately detecting those emergent failures. So let's take a look at each type of protection. So once the strategies are in place, data is flowing, and they are activated, the next two steps in the process are really where those strategies come to life. This is what I meant when I said that ITIS APM operationalizes asset strategies. So step 3 in the work process is monitor. Is my strategy effective? Does it need to be tweaked for my particular operation or for a particular piece of equipment? So let's look at an activity protection in more detail. So what you see here is a run chart of a PM performing thermography every 6 weeks. The green triangles here indicate that expected frequency for doing that PM. The green checkboxes show me when that PM was actually completed. Now this is a date stamp pulled directly from EAM once that PM is completed. And the yellow shaded areas show deviation from that expected PM frequency. Obviously, in this case, the PM is not being done on time. Instead of every 45 days, it's being done every 155 days. And therefore, the health indicator at the top for this particular protection is bright red. At the bottom, we can see the failure modes and associated risk of not doing this PM at the expected frequency. And we can also pull in a tabulated view of the work done against the assets. You always have line of sight to that as well. So this gives a really quick and easy visual of PM compliance, but also brings to light the trade-off between the cost of maintenance or actually performing the PM versus the associated risk presented by not doing that maintenance. So this is a fairly straightforward example. So now let's jump into a condition-based protection. The visuals for every protection are very similar, so I'll just highlight a few differences on this condition-based protection. In this example, we're pulling in an inboard bearing temperature pi tag, which is continuous data, and you can see two different escalation thresholds horizontally across the chart in orange. The analytics are set up such that when this temperature exceeds those thresholds, something automatically is triggered. The application essentially raises its hand and notifies you of this behavior. Now, more than just exceeding this threshold one time, we have this blue shaded area, which we call an excursion. And this represents the duration in that condition. How long has the temperature exceeded this given threshold? Additionally, the thresholds can be set up such that different things happen once those limits are crossed. Maybe at the lower limit, you want to just automatically notify users something's going on. But once that higher limit is exceeded, you want to actually generate an advisory, which we'll go into in a minute, or even automatically generate a work order back in EAM. All of this is possible, and all of this is easily configured in the application. Now, one final thing I'll highlight here is you can actually overlay the work done in the same chart. The gray triangles shown here represent when those PMs were completed on this particular asset. The red triangles show the reactive or corrective work. In this case, we replaced the bearings. By pulling in and actually correlating different data sources, one from OSI Pi, historian tag data, and the other from your EAM work history, the application actually gives you a better picture of what's going on with this particular asset. Now, let's walk through the third and final type of protection, which is our pattern protection. Now, again, this looks very similar to the condition protection we just looked at. However, we're using artificial intelligence learning to evaluate more complex patterns in the data. And in this example, when two bearing temperatures begin to deviate from each other. So for these two tags, two continuous data tags that are pulled in, you'd expect the inboard and outboard temperatures to remain pretty close to each other, within a few degrees. But when they begin to deviate, that's when you want to be alerted. So the purple shaded areas shown here represent these deviations and this condition that you want to detect. The analytic is set up such that when this condition is detected and for a given duration of time, an advisory is automatically generated and is represented in this chart by the blue diamond. It's also listed below. So now we're entering into that fourth step in the work process, which is act. Again, you're acting by exception and through these automatically generated advisories. So they help you with that recourse of action. So let's take a look at what this advisory is telling us. So in an advisory, we have some general information at the top, failure modes, priority, target completion date. All of this is pre-configured in the APM application as the advisory is created. If I scroll down to the bottom here, you can see these orange bubbles off to the side that represent what we call evidence against the asset. Once one advisory is generated for a given asset, as the analytics fire and detects certain characteristics or behaviors that you want to be notified of, those pieces of evidence are accrued into a single advisory, making it easy to recount the timeline of what is actually going on with the asset. Now, as I scroll back to the top, you'll notice on the right-hand side a list of reviewers here. Any one person or even a team of people can be assigned to a given advisory, in which case they can all collaborate on what to do about this given situation. There is the ability to leave comments and keep those records, of course. But what's really unique about the application is this bi-directional integration with EAM, which I talked about earlier. So if you decide as a team that the recourse for this asset is to create a work order, you can click this work request button in the upper right-hand quadrant, and the application will send the pertinent information to that connected EAM system, create a work order. There will be a direct link here shown in APM back to the work request. So you have that integration and that link. And then finally, once the work order is executed and completed, that date stamp will actually come back to IDIS automatically and close out the advisory. So this creates a really, really nice full circle work process so that users don't have to manage work in two different systems. APM gives you the data and the insights you need to make a sound decision about performing the maintenance on your assets, but EAM is still the master source for planning, scheduling, and executing that work. Everything is synergized and connected to make it really, really seamless and easy for the users. And I'll just point out a couple more capabilities within the application just to highlight. So the first is a list of advisories. So we walk through one single advisory, but what's really nice about this application is a lot of plants, a lot of different facilities have a daily stand-up morning meeting, O&M meeting, where they're trying to plan their work for the day. And this application shows you a list of all the advisories that were generated automatically, and then automatically prioritizes them as well, gives you the state, whether they've been submitted, meaning there is a work request that's being planned, scheduled, and executed, or if it's active, in which case it needs some information to take action against. So this is just a really, really nice summary of all the advisories, all the analytics coming together and making it easy for those teams and those daily users to use the application. Additionally, for every asset strategy that's active and deployed, we have what's called a twin profile page, and it just gives a really nice snapshot of those 4 steps in the work process: assess, protect, monitor, and act for each asset. So upper left quadrant, you have your risk assessment. So you know your risk exposure today and at the end of the mission time for that given asset. Bottom left is the second step, which is protect. So your coverage tells you how well protected am I against all of those failure modes that I've established. And then what are my primary failure modes that could, expose me to the most risk? The upper right-hand quadrant is monitor. So it just gives you a health barometer of how are my protections doing? How effective is my strategy working? And which ones do I need to pay attention to? And then bottom right is that act quadrant. What are the active advisories by priority? And what do I need to act on today to mitigate risk for my asset? And then finally, we have our watch list. Anyone can add a particular asset to their watch list just by clicking this watch list star in the upper right-hand quadrant. And it adds it to a panel where you can get a quick snapshot of any assets in your facility that you might want to pay special attention to. It gives you an overview of those 4 steps. Where am I from a health standpoint? How many advisories do I have open? And if you actually flip over that watch list card, it gives you an automatically generated evaluation of the health and status of that particular asset, and even tells you the cost of doing an activity. So again, you can make that trade-off comparison in your mind between how much does it cost to actually perform this particular action or do this maintenance versus how much risk am I exposing my operation to. So you can constantly balance that trade-off between cost and risk.